Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the People's School for Marxist-Leninist Studies. Tonight is October 1st, 2024. What we'll be learning today is we'll be going over communism versus fascism, on peace and war, democracy versus autocracy, and under fascism and communism, culture is for whom? But before we begin the presentations tonight, I will turn the floor over to for an opening introduction.
Thank you. My name is SM Safone, and I'm the Assistant National Secretary for Labor United Educational League, or LUL. I'd like to start by greeting our comrades from the Trade Union International of Pensioners and Retirees on today, the International Day for the Elderly. LUL stands resolutely behind their fight to end the privatization of pensions as well as Medicare. I'd like to say tonight, the class struggle in the U.S. is coming to a head as we enter the final stretch of the presidential campaign. Almost 100,000 workers are on strike right now in the Pacific Northwest and the Eastern and Gulf Coasts. Machinists at Boeing have been on strike for 2 weeks, joined at 12:01 a.m. today by the longshoremen on the Eastern and Gulf Coasts. These port workers are fighting for their livelihoods as the port operators are trying to replace them with computers. It is fitting that the class tonight is on a pamphlet written by someone who even anti-communist business unionists labeled as, quote, the greatest union organizer who ever lived, unquote, Comrade William Z. Forster. With that, LUL calls on all comrades in the affected areas, both the Pacific Northwest and the Eastern Gulf Coast, to meet the workers on the picket lines, as their fight is our fight. Thank you.
And with that, we will go to the presentation now.
Okay, so this first section is on peace and war. Socialism is for peace, fascism is for war. In no sphere does the fundamental difference between socialism and fascism stand out more clearly than in the vital matter of peace and war. In Nazi Germany, the monopoly capitalists, the organizers of imperialist war, reigned supreme. Their economic system, plagued with, quote, overproduction, industrial crisis, and mass unemployment, can only be kept going upon the basis of a war economy. Their greed for profits, prosecuted vigorously in all corners of the earth, brings them into violent collisions with other imperialist states. They seek the solution of all their problems, economic breakdown, mass discontent, and international rivalries, through war. Fascism is war. Recognizing the logic of the situation, the fascists everywhere systematically glorify imperialism and war. They picture human mass slaughter as the greatest aim of mankind, the measure of all social progress. Mussolini says, quote, fascism sees in the imperialistic spirit, i.e., in the tendency for nations to expand, a manifestation of their vitality. War alone brings to their maximum tension all human energies and stamps the seal of nobility on those people who have the virtue to face it. Hitler said on December 9th, 1930, quote, in the long run, the sword will decide everything. Fascist youth are taught that their greatest ambition should be to die in an imperialistic war. Fascist countries and fascist groups everywhere are distinguished by their ultra-chauvinistic nationalism and warlike character. Hitler's so-called New World Order, could he set it up, would be only a jangling collection of mutually hostile and antagonistic states, kept together by armed force and holding before the world an endless prospect of ever more brutal and devastating war. Since the first days of his seizure of power in Germany, Hitler has proceeded upon a policy of war. With the help of the British Tories, who hoped that he would turn his growing power against the Soviet Union, Hitler militarized the whole German state. In building up his tremendous armed force, he has reorganized the entire economy of Germany upon a war basis. No less important to his war policy, Hitler broke up the organizations of the peace-loving, democratic masses of the people, thereby giving the big capitalist imperialists a free hand to prosecute their warlike program. Hitler's policy of aggression and war found its logical culmination in Germany's violent clash with the militant, imperialist, Anglo-American alliance, and in his bid for world conquest. In total contrast to the warlike character of Nazis' fascism and of world capitalism generally stands the peace policy of Soviet socialism. The Soviet economic system does not require the violent stimulant of war in order to keep going. On the contrary, with production and distribution balanced, and with no unsaleable surpluses clamoring for outlets in foreign markets, the Soviet economy imperatively needs a regime of peace for its development. The peace policy of socialism is rooted in its economic system. This peace policy is further fortified by the fact that the great capitalists, the makers of modern war, have been long since totally defeated in the USSR, and the full political power resides in the hands of the democratic and peace-loving toiling masses. Socialist workers and farmers who hold the power in the USSR have no interest in exploiting the peoples of foreign lands. Hence, they have no urge to war. Whereas fascism is impelled along a policy of war by the very nature of its fundamental economic and political structure, the whole makeup of socialism commits the latter irresistibly to a policy of peace. While Nazism has no other perspective than war, Soviet socialism has consistently sought to live in harmonious economic and political relations with all the other countries. Socialism is the bearer of world peace. Mankind will find in an eventual world federation of socialist countries the final end of war. In accordance with the nature of its socialist economic and political system, the Soviet Union, ever since its foundation, has conducted a ceaseless struggle for world peace. Born in the fight of the Russian masses against World War I, one of the first official acts of the newly born Soviet government was a call to the people of the world to put an end to that suicidal imperialist war. Soviet influence ever afterward has also been constantly exerted on the side of peace. Repeatedly, the USSR proposed the complete or partial disarmament of all countries. It also followed the policy of making non-aggression pacts with the capitalist states. And it was the world leader of the, quote, collective security plan to restrain the war aggressor states by an international peace front of all the democratic peoples. In the imperialist World War II, the Soviet government, true to its basic peace policy, maintained an attitude of neutrality and of preventing the spread of the war, despite constant efforts by both sides to involve it in the ruinous struggle. The USSR has built up powerful armed forces, but these are for defense, not for preying upon other peoples. There is no such thing as, quote, red imperialism, nor can there be, because in the Soviet Union there is no monopoly capitalism, the fountainhead of imperialism. It is absurd to characterize as imperialism the active assistance given by the USSR to the attacked peoples of Spain and China, or to condemn as imperialism the peaceful joining to the USSR of the peoples of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Eastern Poland, and Bessarabia, a federation which was carried out with their overwhelming consent. And as for Finland, the Soviet government would have been able to peacefully settle with the Finnish people the boundary changes necessary for the safety of Leningrad, had it not been that British, French, and American imperialists interfered with the negotiations, in the hope that their machinations would result in the long-planned general capitalist war against the USSR.
And with that, we will stop for a round of discussion. Just one comment I wanted to make, especially in that last slide, that definitely struck me of the red imperialism, which would later be a line of the Maoists in the 50s and 60s. So,
the capitalist press, it was pushed initially by media moguls like William Randolph Hearst, that Nazism and slash fascism were identical to communism. And, obvious thing that anyone who, just took a second to think about it would realize that the name of the Axis powers was, the official name was the Anti-Comintern Pact, the Anti-Communist International Pact. If they were just a faction of socialism that were had gripes with the Soviet Union, they would still not call themselves, make their main enemy another socialist faction. They would have made
60
the
seconds.
capitalist countries their main enemy. So, just a glaring example.
Yeah, unless it's on some future slides, can anybody list what to look for in the beginnings of a fascist state? Because I know one thing that sounds like they're in common is the state comes before the person, but I know that there's a vast difference between the people, the workers owning the state and running the state versus the fascist version of control. So what are two or three signs that to look for to see if your state is becoming fascist? Thank you.
Yeah, I'd say the two telltale signs in the early stages is targeting of the trade union movement to the extent of even shutting down trade unions like we've seen in the Ukraine, where any business over a certain amount of people can't be unionized, for example. And also the repression of communist parties. As you saw in, say, McCarthyism, where the Communist Party was repressed, that was a proto-fascist step. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just wanted to point out that in most fascist countries, you'll see that they'll try and create a mask of trade unionism. In Nazi Germany, they had what was called the German Labor Front, and what this was just it was a business union. It was a union controlled by the bosses that didn't allow for collective bargaining. It was it really wasn't a union at all.
And we will also be touching on the German labor front as well during this presentation.
Yeah, so I was gonna piggyback off what Tom said and giving an example from the Ukraine during the Maidan coup. I forget what the title of the union in the Ukraine was that did this, but it was the union that was working with uh, the AFL-CIO through the American Federation of Teachers was working with this union and supporting this union to back the coup. They essentially staged a fake miners' strike, as well as a fake general strike. But the miners' strike, they dressed up some of their office staff as miners to walk around like they were striking, and these so-called miners just happened to come from the Donbass area, where which rose up against the coup.
I think the only thing to add is you'll see a lot more uh, uh, continuity than rupture. Um, uh, it before the outright banning of all of the political parties and eviscerating industrial relations and so on. You'll have variety of increasingly repressive laws as as the capitalists sense that they are losing control over society. Um, uh, and they will try, as they did try with the Uhuru case,
60 seconds.
to use um, uh, certain interpretations of the law to justify more extreme measures of political repression.
If there are no other hands, we'll return to the presentation.
Democracy versus autocracy. Okay, so Soviet democracy versus fascist dictatorship. As in all other respects, Soviet socialism and Nazi fascism differ fundamentally on the question of democracy, both in theory and practice. Proletarian democracy, said Lenin in 1918, is a million times more democratic than any bourgeois democracy. The Soviet government is a million times more democratic than the most democratic bourgeois republic. Stalin, speaking on the new Soviet constitution at the time it was being adopted, said, democracy in capitalist countries where there are antagonistic classes is in the last analysis the democracy for the strong, democracy for the propertied minority. Democracy in the USSR, on the contrary, is democracy for all. In his famous pamphlet, Mastering Bolshevik, and on the right you can see the New Outlook Publishers book cover for Mastering Bolshevism, in the spirit of the Soviet democracy, said, we must pay careful attention to the voice of the masses, to the voice of the rank and file members of the party, to the voice of the so-called small men, to the voice of the people. These democratic principles are fully realized in the life of the Soviet state. The people are guaranteed incomparably the most extensive rights of any nation in the world, including rights of suffrage, speech, organization, and conscience, the right to work, of recreation, of full education, of social security, of racial equality, of sex equality, etc. The Stalin Constitution is by far the most democratic in the world. Contradicting the current anti-Soviet slanders, an impartial witness, Professor John McMurray of the University of London, says in his book Creative Society, communism is both in theory and in the substantial economic side and practice democratic. In the real sense, Soviet Russia is already far more democratic a society than any other has ever been. As against the profoundly democratic character of Soviet society, the Nazi regime is altogether autocratic. Nazi propaganda is saturated with contempt for masses and adulation for their so-called natural rulers of the people, the elite, or leaders. This fascist elite is in reality nothing more than the organized gang of agents of the most reactionary sections of finance capital, who at the moment find themselves in power. The Nazi program calls for all power to the leader. Hitler declared at the 1935 Nazi Congress that the Führer is the party and the party is the Führer. And in his book Mein Kampf, page 520, he stated also that the National Socialist Party must not be the servant of the mass, but its master. Mussolini's writings are crowded with similar autocratic sentiments, and in this country, the Nazi echo, Lawrence Dennis, states in his Dynamics of War and Revolution, let me say categorically that I do not believe in democracy or the intelligence of the masses. The Nazi regime is organized from top to bottom around such anti-democratic principles, and the masses of the people are utterly deprived of all democratic rights. At the Seventh World Congress of the Communist International, Georgy Dimitrov said correctly, "Fascism in power is the most open terrorist dictatorship of the most reactionary, most chauvinistic, and imperialistic elements of finance capital. It is naked, autocratic domination by the biggest capitalists over the toiling masses, who have been robbed of all parliamentary democracy, and who have had their trade unions, political parties, cooperatives, and other democratic mass organizations ruthlessly broken up. In the United States, we can see the same autocratic trend developing in the reactionary policies of the big capitalists and their political agents. The Nazi one-party system represents the suppression of all the political organizations of the working class and petty bourgeoisie by the dominant big capitalists. The proletarian dictatorship, so named by Karl Marx almost 100 years ago, on the contrary, is the rule of the toiling masses. In the USSR, dictatorship of the proletariat constitutes a temporary form of socialist society adopted for that period in which it is still necessary for the victorious workers and farmers to hold in check the remnants of the former ruling classes and also to defend themselves from the external capitalist enemy states. The Soviet regime, however, is heading toward a stateless society. The one-party system of the USSR, opposite to the situation in Nazi Germany, signifies and expresses the victory of the toiling classes. On this point, in the pamphlet on the new Soviet Constitution, soon to be available on New Outlook Publishers, Stalin says, "Several parties and consequently freedom of parties can only exist in a society where antagonistic classes exist whose interests are hostile and irreconcilable, where there are capitalists and workers, landlords and peasants, kulaks and poor peasants. But in the USSR, there are no longer such classes as capitalists, landlords, kulaks, etc. In the USSR, there are only two classes, workers and peasants, whose interests not only are not antagonistic, but on the contrary, amicable. Consequently, there are no grounds for the existence of several parties, and therefore, for the existence of freedom for such parties in the USSR, there are grounds for only one party, the Communist Party. In the USSR, only one party can exist, the Communist Party, which boldly defends the interests of the workers and peasants to the very end."
And with that, we will break for another discussion round.
Yeah, I just want to give a book recommendation for anybody who wants to know more about how like this Soviet democracy actually works in practice. It's a book we have on New Outlook Publishers, Soviet Democracy versus Bourgeois Democracy by I think it's Mifflin, MB Mifflin or something like that. I think it's his name. But it's a good book that goes into like the structure of how the USSR is democratic.
Yeah, it seems so simple. I never really thought about it until we just read that portion that Stalin wrote on how in the Soviet Union there were only two classes, the workers and the peasants. Well, no wonder why you wouldn't see fascism rise for many reasons in the Soviet Union, but especially since there was no capitalists. But also, this was more on the first section. I was a little busy, but I don't know if we talked about capitalist states. This is a response to one of the comrades, or fascist states, excuse me, how they really not only prevent unions and the Communist Party, but they exploit the workers. Like it's like a super exploitation of workers, and that the workers, as far as the class goes, are really just toiling away more so than in bourgeois liberal capitalist societies. Just want to bring that up. You just look at, I think actually in that book it talks about Nazi Germany's workers at the time. That's all.
Thank you, Comrade. And in fact, we have a bit of an animation about that later on in this presentation. Comrade Angelo, did you want to respond?
During the Popular Front, the party, along with Roosevelt, redefined the definition of democracy. This is very important. Write this down and then Google it to make sure what I'm saying is correct. The greatest good for the greatest number. That was their new definition of democracy. The greatest good for the greatest number. That's exactly Soviet society. Thank you.
Yeah, let's see if I can be succinct about this. For anyone listening in the future, the one benefit or one of the many benefits of having one party is in elections. Since you don't have to represent a different party, you actually are forced to run on your merits alone. And it's more of a direct democracy. So I just wanted to point that out, how it's unfair to call it non-democracy, even if there's just one party. Thank you.
Remember, there's one party in the West. It's called the Money Party. Okay? It's whether they call themselves Tory, Democrat, Republican, whatever. In the West, the parties are basically owned by the capitalists. So they have one party also. Thank you.
Thank you, Comrade Angelo. If there are no other hands, we'll move on to the third section, which is my section. We will be continuing democracy versus autocracy, covering the subjects of labor, women, and youth. The Soviet Constitution, Article 123, says, and this clause is strictly applied, equality of rights of citizens of the USSR, irrespective of their nationality or race, in all spheres of economic, state, cultural, social, and political life, is an indefeasible law. Any direct or indirect restriction of the rights of, or conversely, any establishment of direct or indirect privileges for citizens on account of their race or nationality, as well as any advocacy of racial or national exclusiveness or hatred and contempt, is punishable by law. In industry, as in politics and other spheres, the Nazis apply their leadership principles to the exclusion of all democracy. The employers are the autocratic leaders in the shops and factories, and the workers have nothing to say about setting their wages and working conditions. It is the open shop carried to the maximum. The so-called German Labor Front is only a monster company union, but more degenerated and employer-controlled than anything we have ever had in the United States. Hitler tries to justify this monstrous tyranny thus. The employers have worked their way up to the top by their industry and their efficiency, and by virtue of this selection, which shows that they belong to a higher type, they have the right to lead. Every leader of industry will forbid any interference from the workers. How does that sound familiar? In contrast with this system of Nazi industrial slavery, the workers of the USSR enjoy an industrial freedom utterly unknown in any other country. Their great trade unions, now numbering 25,500,000 members, not only actively look after questions of hours, wages, working conditions, etc., but they also have charge of the gigantic social security system. They play, furthermore, a vital role in organizing production, and from their ranks comes the tens of thousands of managers of industry and political leaders. The great democratic trade unions are the mass foundation of Soviet democracy. Compared with them, the Nazi Labor Front is a ghastly mockery, and such unions as our AFL and CIO are but skeleton organizations, both in size and function. The working class and peasant woman is especially a victim of the brutal Nazi dictatorship. She has no democratic rights and is reduced to an inferior status, economically, politically, and socially. The Nazi aim is to make her into just a breeder of industrial slaves and soldiers for the capitalist ruling class. She is excluded from political life and is denied a higher education. Long ago, Spengler, from whom the Nazis have copied much, said, years of decision, "Woman is to be neither comrade nor beloved, but only mother." In this thoroughly reactionary spirit, Hitler, at the 1934 Nazi Congress, outlined the status of women under German fascism as follows. The world of man is the state. The world of man is his struggle, his self-dedication to the community, and thus we may say that the world of women is a smaller one. For her world is her husband, her family, her children, and her house. We do not believe it to be right for woman to penetrate into the world of man, into his special sphere. On the contrary, we feel it is natural for those worlds to remain separated. And you can see some Nazi propaganda on the role of women. Do you notice a trend? The Soviet woman, contrary to all this fascist reactionism, enjoys the fullest equality. One of the greatest achievements of the Russian Revolution was to strike the shackles from doubly enslaved womankind. The Soviet Constitution, Article 12A, provides that women in the USSR are accorded equal rights with men in all spheres of economic, state, cultural, social, and political life. Accordingly, Soviet women are to the forefront in all activities. In the Supreme Soviet, of the 1,090 delegates, 187 are women, as against no woman in the German Reichstag and only half a dozen in the United States Congress. In Soviet industry, the 11 million employed women get the same wages as men doing similar jobs. They work in all occupations, many of them being factory and farm managers, locomotive drivers, ship captains, surgeons, scientists, etc. There are 100,000 women industrial engineers in the USSR, as against 10,000 in the rest of the world. In 1938, women numbered 43% of the students in the universities of the Soviet Union, and 66,000 physicians, or 60% of the grand total in the USSR, were women. In her home life, the Soviet woman is also surrounded by protections and freedoms quite unknown in any other country. Small wonder that the birth rate in the USSR is more than double that of either Germany, England, or the United States. And you can see a Soviet captain, Valentina Orlikova, and her crew running a merchant vessel. And on youth, Nazis and other fascists shout a great deal about the youth and what fascism has to offer the new generation. But this is all a monstrous lie. The reality is that in Nazi Germany, as in other capitalist countries, the way is barred to a real life for young people. The German industries, the government, the educational system, and all other vital social institutions, based on human exploitation and saturated with crisis and rottenness, are firmly in the grip of the big capitalists and their agents. The only real opportunity open before the great masses of proletarian and farmer youth in Nazi Germany is to perish on the field of battle. And this is now opened also as a future for the youth of the United States. And you can see some Banderite fascist youth children there, and what a very odd circle symbol on their shirts there. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, is truly the land of the youth. Every line of social endeavor, industrial, political, cultural, is wide open and clamoring for the youth. In the Supreme Soviet, of the 1,090 delegates, 596 are under 35 years of age. This situation is typical of every phase of Soviet life. In no country in world history has the youth blossomed as now in the USSR. Fascism teaches young people to die and drives them into mass slaughter. Socialism shows them the way to live and provides them the means for doing so. And that's an ad for the Commissal on the right. Or the Red Youth. All right. And we will break for another discussion round then.
Yeah, I assume it's just basic cash, but what did Hitler or even the Nazis, what did they get by backing capital? Does a Nazi state have to inherently be capitalistic? Thank you.
So Hitler and the Nazis had the backing of the Junkers, or the large landholders in Germany. Also, a lot of American, British, and French industrialists also gave Hitler and the Nazis cheap loans to remilitarize, and also, in a sense, offshored some of their production into Nazi Germany where labor was cheap. So they profited, Hitler got to rebuild, everyone there won, except the common people.
A book I would recommend that actually isn't written by a communist, but I was reading some communist source and it quoted it, was Who Financed Hitler? I forget who wrote it, but the picture actually has Hitler wearing like one of those Monopoly Man top hats, if you know what I mean. It's really fascinating because at first it really, the bourgeoisie were not really comfortable with the Nazi Party, and they slowly became comfortable when they knew that the alternative that was rising was the Communist Party. And you could kind of see some parallels today. You could say that with, I wouldn't call him a fascist, but there's definitely fascist forces behind Trump. And you could see people, the bourgeois, be kind of uncomfortable with him. And then real quick, kind of relating it today, I think the women question is weaponized by fascists today in our country. And you could see that as what the Nazis did. And children are also weaponized. And I just think we need to keep that in mind. That's all.
Thank you. On that note as well, if anyone's familiar with David Rovax, he wrote a song about Henry Ford because in 1949, the Ford Motor Company sued the US government for bombing their factories in Berlin that was making armaments for the Nazi war machines, and they actually won. So he wrote a nice little song called Henry Ford Was a Fascist. Do recommend.
I believe the New York Times before they said that Obama was hope for our times, they said the same thing about Hitler. Um, another Hirsch circular.
Yeah, Comrade asked whether fascism had to be capitalist, and the answer is yes. We read the book a couple of classes ago, Fascism and Social Revolution by R. or Rajani Pomdat. And in the book, he very clearly lays it out. He shows that at a certain point, the working class is so developed, and the capitalist class, which it raises the prices of their goods so high that the working class cannot afford it, so they need to ship it abroad. This is where the imperialism comes in place. They need foreign markets to actually sell their goods. It's in this moment that they realize that they're in a crisis. Their bourgeois democracy, which allows the Communist Party to exist, is no longer affable to the capitalist system. That's when they have to actually crack down on it. And it's a new form
90 seconds.
of a bourgeois government. It's an autocratic one that seeks to crack down on the labor movement in its last retreat.
All right, we will go to our final section tonight.
Thank you. Culture for whom? And this is from the section of the pamphlet entitled Soviet Culture, Nazi Barbarism. As the world capitalist system, caught in the meshes of its own incurable crisis, strangles and smothers, so also its culture withers and dies. Under fascist regimes, which arose where the capitalist crisis reached a very acute stage, the decay of capitalist culture is most pronounced. In fascist Germany, education is decadent. Science is in decline, and the arts are stultified. The whole educational apparatus, universities, colleges, schools, etc., has been drastically curtailed. The only science the fascists are interested is that which advances their war technique and the same tendency is growing in all other capitalist states. The Nazis have a supreme contempt for the popular mind. All they seek is the most effective means to deceive the people into obeying their autocratic commands. Hitler says in Mein Kampf, the receptivity of the masses is very limited. Their ability to understand is small. Only this restricted so-called elite, the ruling capitalist clique, can appreciate or absorb culture. As for the masses, says Hitler, the primitive simplicity of their minds renders them a more easy prey to a big lie than a small one. On this basis, he feeds them the most outrageous demagoguery. In the conquered countries, Nazi culture reaches its lowest depths of degradation. The burning of the books, the persecution of such outstanding scientists as Einstein, the resurrection of astrology, Nordic heathen god worship, and other forms of medieval obscurantism are typical indicators of the cultural barbarism that the Nazis are trying to inflict upon the world. This barbarism is fully in harmony with their ruthless exploitation of the workers in industry, their suppression of every trace of democracy, and their brutal slaughter of the people as cannon fodder in imperialist military adventures. At the other extreme, the Soviet Union represents the progressive cultural tendency. In that country, in full harmony with its socialization of industry, its abolition of human exploitation, and its development of the broadest democracy, there also exists the most intense promotion of culture in all its forms. The economic and political structure of the USSR is healthy and progressive, and so too, naturally, is its culture. The whole country is involved in a mass cultural advance such as the world has never before witnessed. Science, literature, art, or every form of culture is expanding at an unheard of rate. Superstition and ignorance of all sorts are being systematically combated, and this culture is not being restricted to a small ruling exploiting elite, but it is extended to the broadest masses of the people, regardless of their national background. And you see on the side here, peasants in Chuvest Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic learning to read and write in 1930 as part of the Gvidstaya Bezpromatnazi, shortening to Likbets, literally liquidate illiteracy campaign. One of the most striking aspects of the great Soviet cultural renaissance is the tremendous development of mass education. The illiteracy of the Tsarist times, embracing nearly 75% of the people, has now been almost wiped out. In 1913, Russia had but 859 newspapers, which printed only 2.7 million copies. The USSR in 1940 had 8,500 newspapers, with a total circulation of 38 million copies. Today, in the USSR, there are some 40 million pupils in the primary and secondary school grades, as against only about 8 million before the revolution. The Soviet universities and technical schools contained 650,000 students, or about as many as all the rest of Europe put together. In Foreign Affairs for January 1941, Walter Kampfert, a hostile critic of Soviet life, says that while the Germans have closed most of their universities, for 1942, the Soviet plans call for 34 times as many students in various Russian higher schools as there were before the revolution. And as you can see here, a map of the increased literacy of the Soviet Union from 1926 to 1939. The Soviet state has set for itself the unparalleled task of raising the educational level of the workers to that of the intellectuals, says Stalin regarding this revolutionary program. Quote, the elimination of the distinction between mental labor and manual labor can be brought about only by the raising the cultural and technical level of the working class to the level of engineers and technical workers. It would be absurd to think that this is unfeasible. It is entirely feasible under the Soviet system, where the productive forces of the country have been freed from the fetters of capitalism, where labor has been freed from the yoke of exploitation, where the working class is in power, and where the younger generation of the working class has every opportunity of obtaining an adequate technical education. Another tremendous task now being gradually accomplished by the vast Soviet cultural renaissance is to raise the cultural level of the country population up to that of the cities. Ernst Fischer says in his pamphlet, What is Socialism? But is it not the borderline between the worker and the intellectual, between the manual and mental labor, that socialism removes and obliterates? It sets out to efface the age-old distinction between town and country, to overcome immemorial backwardness of the countryside. To this end, mighty educational work is now going on among the millions of collective farmers. Every Soviet village is surging with the new intellectual life brought to it by the growing educational system, by the expanding industrialization, and by the never-sleeping care of the Soviet state. And we see on the right here Comrade Stalin with women from the collective farm in Tajik Soviet Socialist Republic in January 1935. Under Nazi fascism, as under capitalism generally, the individual worker and farmer is reduced to a mere cog in the great capitalist machine, which operates to make wealth for the ruling class and to wage war against other nations. His personality is warped and stunted, and he passes through life robbed of its potential beauties and richness. In the Soviet Union, on the other hand, where there is no ruling, exploiting class, the whole aim of the regime is to develop and expand the toiler's freedom and personality. Capitalism, especially in its fascist aspects, corrodes and destroys human personality. Socialism develops personality to its utmost. In the Soviet Union, there's literally a new type of man in the making, not only in the economic and political sense, but also with regards to his physical, mental, and individual characteristics. And we see this image here of Comrade Paul Robeson, and where he said, in Soviet Russia, I felt for the first time as a full human being. No color prejudice like in Mississippi, no color prejudice like in Washington. It was the first time I felt like a human being. And of course, this was Paul Robeson when he was on trial at the House Un-American Activities Committee, June 12, 1956. And we have a video of Donald Duck on working as a worker in Nazi Germany.
Fun fact, you would think Mickey Mouse would be the most animated featured character from Walt Disney. It is actually Donald Duck, and that is because he was used exclusively throughout the World War II period. And with that, we'll break for our final discussion round.
Walt Disney creating an anti-Nazi cartoon is a little bit of an irony, being that Walt Disney himself was a virulent anti-Semite, and in 1938, he welcomed Nazi director Leni Riefenstahl to his studios. Just a bit of a contradiction there.
Well, I'm sure he didn't want to stand trial in the 40s, but
I'm glad it shows how it's like under fascism, because you just get worked to death. It's true. It shows it in the cartoon. Thank you. That's all.
Okay. I think we should all ask ourselves a question. Is reactionary the same as fascist? That's a good question. There are a lot of reactionaries that we call fascist that should not be called fascist. We're actually saying the wolf, the story with the little boy with the wolf. You say the wolf too many times, when the real wolf comes, nobody's going to listen because you called everybody a wolf for God knows how many years. It's the same thing. A reactionary is different. You can have reactionary views and not be a fascist. On the same token, you cannot have progressive views and be a fascist. That's opposites. Because fascism itself is going back to the past. That's why Make America Great Again has been discussed. It's going back to another time. That's what fascism does. It goes back to another time when supposedly life was better. And we all know the 50s is what they're talking about. The 50s was horrible for people here. They electrocuted people like us in the 50s. We were fired from our jobs. We would not be allowed to have a party. So, what is the signpost of fascism? Number one, the banning of the Communist Party. Number two, the limitation or banning of trade unions. Number three, a scapegoat, some kind of a scapegoat. All those three things together are the characteristics of fascism. So, some people have told me Putin is a fascist. I've heard this from people. Well, he's not a fascist. He is a reactionary. Definitely a reactionary, but he's not a fascist. The trade union movements exist in Russia freely. The communist movement exists in Russia freely. There is no scapegoating of any large group. The closest comes is LGBT, and that's not the same type of scapegoating. Under fascism, you send them to concentration camps. Remember, under when the immigrants came here, many of them were put in concentration camps. Do you remember that?
90 seconds.
Thank you. Bye.
All right. On the educational front, I think it's important to mention what I would call the night education after work hours. There's a good book out there, Behind the Urals, and it was written by John Scott. John Scott was the son of was it Nearing, Scott Nearing, right? Of which one of our cells hold that name. And before Roosevelt recognized Russia, many people, including in the United States, went over there to get jobs. This was 1930. And there was a big push industrial-wise, of course, to take 100 years and do the same amount of industrialization in 10 years. So John Scott worked what was called Behind the Urals, and that was to have a huge industrial complex where it wasn't so wide open or accessible by the Germans. During that time, yes, it was hard work, and many of the people moved there in barracks before any places or homes were able to be put up. But after your work schedule, you could go to continuing education, and it's totally free. And what the workers did if they wanted to get ahead was go to those
90
schools.
seconds.
Okay, they go to those schools. They could get engineering degrees, so they could work a hard day. And if they were able to, they went to school. So while they were working, they actually still had the possibility of furthering their education and being promoted while they were working. It's really was kind of quite a renaissance behind the Urals in that it was dirty, cold, lots of problems, but all of the workers that were there, both men and women, had a lot of opportunity during that period. I just want to mention that, what they call continuing education.
Minutes. Thank you.
Just really quickly wanted to mention, to kind of piggyback off of what Comrade just mentioned, there was a large amount of African Americans who moved to the Soviet Union around like the 20s and 30s. And it's literally because like they condemned racism, like it was mentioned earlier with Paul Robeson, where he felt human. And a lot of folks ended up moving out there. I remember recently, it was like an RT documentary I watched a few years ago that was talking about this movement and how they have their own Oprah in Russia now, like somebody who's been on television for decades. I can't remember, her name escapes me, but yeah, that's all I got to say.
Thank you, Comrade. We actually did a class on that. If you want to go look back at one of our earlier classes.
Yeah, in an earlier section, it was mentioned with regards to the Soviet Union, you had the right to work. And I just want to stress that right to work is nothing like the so-called right to work we have in the US. You actually had a right to a job and a right to a decent living in the Soviet Union. No such right exists here in the US. And earlier in the class, when I was responding to something Comrade said, there was a union, and I forget what the name of the union, but I believe it centered around free trade union in Ukraine, that the AFL-CIO worked through in their helping of the State Department with the Maidan coup. And they staged a fake general strike as well as a fake minor strike. But those miners that they were pretending to be came from Donbass and were actually part of the resistance to the Maidan coup. What they did is they dressed up office staff to look like the miners and presented it like the miners were going on, the Donbass were going on strike. And then later on, the same union, when they were entering in their attempts at collective bargaining with the Ukrainian state, they were using members of Azov battalion justification.
Yeah, sure. I'm seeing, like, watching that cartoon, I thought was somewhat instructive because it seems like Donald Duck was put in a situation where he was in a workers' union that was working incredibly hard, according to the cartoon. You can work 48 hours a day in the service of nationalism, while the government itself does not necessarily represent the wills and desires of the people of that government. Whereas the Soviet system is in work for workers' liberation. So there's a huge difference between that.
Yeah, I just wanted to point something out. I love that video. I watch it every once in a while. But if you ever look at Soviet anti-fascist propaganda, you'll notice a huge difference in how it presents the fascists. It usually doesn't even show so much of the face as like just a silhouette. But in that cartoon, you could see that they couldn't help themselves with bringing up, racist caricatures of their enemies, harkening back to the yellow journalism days of World War I. You could see it especially with Hirohito. They use that racist caricature of the Japanese man with huge buck teeth and big beady eyes. So I just thought it was interesting, like how the American propaganda presented the enemy versus how Soviet Union did.
With that, we'll move on to our closing announcements and wrap up.
Features of
New Outlook Publishers is our sister publishing company, and for an update on that, I will turn it over.
Yes, thank you. Please visit our partner publishers, New Outlook Publishers. You can find a lot of great works there, including the topic of tonight's class, Communism versus Fascism by William Randolph. Our latest release, Lest We Forget by Michael Hanusiak, and that documents the decline of the Ukrainian Nazi collaborators. Very important read. It's a lot of information. It's not well known here in the US. And once again, the web address is newoutlookpublishers.store.
Thank you. And we will close out with the International.
council of condescending saviors to rule us from a judgment hall. We workers ask not for their favors, let us consult for